Hello and welcome back to the From My Perspective podcast, where I, Jackson McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football and NFL landscapes that could be changing the football landscape in the very near future. So we just finished up talking about what essentially is the 32 players to watch this upcoming season that maybe haven't gotten enough shine or haven't had their breakout yet. That is now done, one from each team. So if you haven't seen all those, go back and watch those. But we move on to the next chapter, and even though we are so far out from the season, I think that this would be a good time to highlight some conferences that are in college football that I've got quite a few questions about. So I'll be focusing on my 5 big questions entering the season for the SEC. It's such a dominant conference, or is at least perceived to be that way. So making sure to kind of put that all in perspective and really look and see at what the major storylines are going to be and some things that could really change how the SEC season goes throughout this year. So just jumping right into it, number 5, we've got South Carolina, who was a above 500 team last year, and they've made a move that could either bring them really high up in the SEC ranks this year, or it could see kind of the fall of a star that, or at least a star in the making that we had been watching for numerous years now. Spencer Rattler is the quarterback at South Carolina, and we need to know, is he the guy? Once upon a time, Spencer Rattler was the future of college football. He was the prize that Oklahoma managed to win with Lincoln Riley, and he was going to become the next in line of their endless Heisman candidates. Then everything kind of fell apart. I believe he spent 3 years there. He got 9 games last season, if I'm recalling correctly. Caleb Williams, for the most part, kind of passed him up, and everything just the narrative around Spencer Rattler completely flipped on its head. It went from this prodigy child, somebody who was going to come in and set football alight. He was the potential number 1 draft pick entering the season last year, decided that he would be better off staying in college but leaving his team and moving to a different one as the year went on. And now we'll get to see that in South Carolina. As I mentioned, South Carolina was 7-6, but the weird thing about their roster, they didn't have a single passer over 1,000 yards last year. That seems absolutely absurd. And Spencer Rattler now gets the opportunity to come in and, really take over this offense. Now, the real question for me entering this agreement between him and South Carolina is, it doesn't look like they really have anybody behind him that they super duper love or trust. If Spencer Rattler fails, you don't have a Caleb Williams anymore. And while that does come with the pressure, that also means that the team as a whole is really betting on Rattler. So at the end of the day, it's win or go home. You've got to figure it out, and you've got to figure it out fast, because I believe he's only got 1 year of eligibility left. And if you can't make it work here, I think your NFL dreams are probably gone. If, outside of the practice squad route or the third string quarterback, I don't see anything beyond that. And it's really going to be interesting to see what South Carolina does, especially as a team that is on the rise comparatively in the SEC. Now, to point out other teams that are on the rise, this is my 4th question. We've seen Kentucky stepped it up last year. Arkansas looked good. Tennessee, Ole Miss. The list is fairly prominent, but does it matter? The SEC doesn't have parity right now. You've got Alabama, you've got Georgia, and that's the end of the list. You're basically playing for 3rd place right now, and have been for a number of years now. Of course, you get your Florida or your LSU that kind of come out and really perform well for a little bit, but as far as what looks to be the staple for the SEC right now, it's Alabama and Georgia. So we mentioned there's 3 teams I want to focus on here. I'm going to take Ole Miss out of the race. They did look really good last year, but they lost just about everyone under the sun. Sam Williams, Matt Corral, Ontario Drummond, and there's a couple more in there that I'm missing. And then you've got the transfers like John Reese Plumlee and so on and so forth. Ole Miss does not look like they're going to stay up to that level. That's a question in and of itself, but I think that's an easier one. It won't be on the list. But when you look at Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, all 3 of them were above 500 last year. All 3 of them, or 2 of the 3, have potentially Heisman winning quarterbacks. I think Hendon Hooker and Will Levis are both pretty high on the odds right now, at least relatively. Arkansas as a unit, they just work well in tandem. You don't really have these stars. I think KJ Jefferson's good. Jalen Catalon got hurt last year, but he was on track to being a top 45 pick in the draft. So you've got talent, but I think they move in more synchronicity than these other three teams. But is Arkansas ceiling high enough to really cause any damage? Is Will Levison good enough to take Kentucky to a New Year's Six bowl? I don't know that either one of those are, you could be solid in your answer. I do think Tennessee is probably the most likely to cause some ripples in what we consider to be a pretty stagnant SEC right now, at least at kind of the pecking order. You get a lot of movement in the middle, but at the top and the bottom, nothing really changes. So this whole season, and this question could just as much be, does the SEC truly have parity? Because we can be promoted that Hendon Hooker is a really good quarterback, and Sam Pittman is a top 3 coach in the SEC, and what have you. And I'm not disrespecting either one of those guys, but you have to wonder that if having that matters truly. Like, does it really have an impact on how the season is going to progress? So that'll be something interesting to watch unfold as the year progresses. Another thing that'll be interesting to watch unfold is the LSU Tigers program as a whole, because now you've got Brian Kelly, who is a very well-known coach. He's got a very high winning percentage, but can he stick the landing in LSU? Notre Dame and LSU are two very different beasts. For one, Notre Dame has the benefits of not being attached to playing an SEC schedule every year, but they also have higher recruiting standards and more difficulties getting students into the building. LSU is the exact opposite. They can get whoever they want in there just about, but they have the issue of playing these hard-hitting teams. So Brian Kelly left his cushy job in South Bend. He's going to get more lax recruiting standards, but he's already taken aim at Nick Saban, so what do you do? Like year one, what are your expectations for LSU? What do you realistically think they can do? With a program like LSU, is winning 9 games in your first year a requirement? Is 7 okay? As you try to get these kids in here that know your system and try to teach it to the ones that are already there. Can you survive and be all right? Or will you already see kids starting to doubt Brian Kelly if he does miss the mark early on? The dual threat quarterback is not a foreign thing to Brian Kelly's offenses at Notre Dame. They've had plenty of them. But is Jaden Daniels enough to win in the SEC? He wasn't even winning at Arizona State, and I know that they had a lot of cultural issues there. As a team, when Jaden Daniels left Arizona State, for example, players were trashing his locker and doing all these, just horrible things. But that in and of itself, it's like, if you're not winning at what would be perceived as a weaker schedule and a less pressurized space to win, can he be the guy who puts you over the hump? Who's behind him? Do you really have a guy that you trust and have somebody that you feel safe relying on if Jaden Daniels doesn't work out? Basically, this question just spawns more questions for me because I don't know that I love Brian Kelly going to LSU in the first place, let alone with what has kind of become together since he's been there. None of it really feels right. Notre Dame feels like they're doing a whole lot better since Brian Kelly has left than Brian Kelly has done since he's left. Everything just feels off to me with that fit, and I'm not in love with it. But he showed an ability to win a lot of football games before. Who's to say he won't do it again? So another team that we have to keep an eye on about winning football games this year, Texas A&M. They have been in the spotlight for better or for worse throughout the entirety of this stretch of time, and can the NIL money buy you wins? It's a big question, and it's something Jimbo Fisher is going to have to stare down the barrel of, because by hook or by crook, he got a ton of talented kids in the building. And now you have the Nick Saban rivalry coming off of a year that you beat Alabama. Everything is dependent on this year. You have to figure it out, and you have to figure it out fast. Luckily for him, again, super talented kids in the building. He has 8 5-star recruits coming in, 3 very talented quarterbacks in the room, Max Johnson, Haynes King, and the name is slipping me on the new incoming freshman, I believe. He looks pretty good as well. But they I mean, they looked like a really good program last year. Even at 8-4, you had two top 15 wins at the time, Auburn and Alabama. I believe it was number 1 and number 11 or number 12 in the poll at that point in time. So, A&M, you got to step it up. You got to figure it out. And the real issue is that if you can't figure it out, what will your NIL money really matter? And, does it start to come under scrutiny if you still get all these large recruiting classes, like they were number 1 in the country this year? Does it start to come into question on how you're getting these kids? Because there's already been a few questions around that, since it is technically illegal to use NIL money to essentially bribe or to offer it to a potential student / athlete before they're on campus, before they are officially enrolled in your college. So where do you leave yourself if you don't figure it out fast? Because you could overlook having the top ranked recruiting class if you just went and had a 13-win season, a 12-win season, you're on top of the mountain. You can't overlook it if you're 7 and 6, and now all of a sudden people are looking at you like, how is your roster that good? Because you're not really putting on a winning program, and you're not fielding these all-star teams. You're not putting a lot of kids in the NFL. You're not doing this. You're not doing that. So we need to probably check into this, because if you're just throwing NIL money, then you're at these kids that aren't even Texas A&M students yet, then sounds like you're breaking the rules. And finally, the biggest question, I think maybe the biggest question in all of college football for me, because the whole debacle was so weird to me. It made no sense. It still makes no sense, because where Brian Harsin is, he's still the head coach of Auburn football. So what happens with Auburn football, and what happens with Brian Harsin moving forward? I mean, you get allegations about having an affair with somebody on the Auburn staff. A former player says that he treats his team poorly. I believe there was some stuff coming out of Arkansas State from whenever he was there that people didn't particularly like him. He went through the ringer in these past few months, and he went through an internal investigation. He passed that test, so yeah, that at least looks good on the outside. I don't know how thorough the internal investigation was, and a lot of people are pointing to the fact that maybe how much he would have been owed on a buyout had a lot to do with him still being there. But I mean, Auburn is in a very, very weird spot right now. They're coming off of a sub 500 year. They were 6-7. Players and coaches both ran away from Auburn as fast as they could this year. You're in a weird spot, and of course you got some guys in there. Zach Calzada's the first name I think of, and he could very well be the starter for them. But you're looking at a team that, while it has prestige and you can get kids into the building, I don't know that anybody will want to go in the building right now, because it looks like a ticking time bomb. It looks like something that is ready to explode on itself, and Brian Harsin is kind of at the forefront of that. He's the face of that. So with the talent leaving, I believe he went through 2 or 3 offensive coordinators. I think it was offensive coordinators. Somebody went somewhere, or he fired one resigned for personal reasons, and now they're on the one that they've got now. His defensive coordinator said, I'm just going to take the same role at Oklahoma State. So there's so much weirdness around the Auburn program. So it really leaves you to wonder if he's got enough talent on the roster, and if he's got enough goodwill with the rest of the team and with the staff and everything to, for one, save his reputation, and for two, keep Auburn from having to offload him next year, or as early as next year, and finding themselves just in a rough state, having a coach that really imploded and left their program in shambles. So those are the 5 biggest questions I have for the SEC. I have plenty more that we could definitely go over, but if you have another question that you can't wait to see answered in the upcoming season, feel free to leave it in the comment section below or on my Twitter. Those will both be linked in the description. For now, that is it for the podcast. This is episode number 9 of From My Perspective, and I'll see you next time.